Yeah, sorry. Oh, yeah.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Chris Phillips. I'm a senior writing fellow at the University of Pennsylvania and author of a couple books, one called Socrates Cafe, another called Constitution Cafe, about different dialogue projects I have established with people around the U.S. and even around the globe. And I'd really, first of all, like to thank Kirby, the Vice President, for visitor experience and education here at the National Constitution Center, for making this exquisite space available for us tonight. It's such an honor to have Lawrence Lessig speaking here today. It's really a rare and beautiful thing to know a scholar who's not just an exceptional thinker, but also a brilliant doer, who bridges the world of thought and the world of action. And Lawrence Lessig is a consummate reformer, radical rabble-rouser in the best sense. He's not an alarmist, but someone who can diagnose problems in a way that then inspires the rest of us, or has the potential to inspire the rest of us, to be part of the solution instead of sort of continuing complacently to be part of the problem. It takes great social conscience and concern. It requires a person to walk the walk himself, maybe to go out of his comfort zone a little bit, because there's a higher calling. And I think that's epitomizes Lawrence Lessig. If and when I grow up, I'd like to be a lot like him. I use his book, Republic Lost, in a class I teach, 2 course sections I teach at Penn, called Money and Democracy. And I wrote to him and asked him if he'd come to Philly and hold a public conversation with me. He's a graduate of Penn, and he readily agreed to that. He responded immediately. I was thrilled and surprised and almost fainted when he said he'd heard of my work. Yeah, but he's and he and I actually sat down at lunch today. I kind of plotted Professor Lessig his plans over the longer term are to have a modern nationwide constitutional convention, and then on an even more grand scale, maybe that'll be the launching pad for a real new constitutional convention. So we were sort of diagramming, even just over post-it notes and napkins this afternoon, about how that might come about, and I felt a little bit the vibes of Thomas Jefferson and his cabal, thinking about them as they sat in that follow room at the Raleigh Tavern. How things that seem to have a rather innocuous beginning can lead to some rather earth-shaking changes over time. But that's the kind of person he is. He readily agreed to come. He cares. He's in a position to do a lot of good, and he's sort of capitalizing on that. He's extraordinarily accomplished in ever so many ways. He's the director of the Edmund J. Sapper Foundation, Center for Ethics at Harvard, and a professor of law at Harvard. Prior to returning to Harvard, Professor Lessig was a law professor at Stanford Law School and the director of Stanford's Center for Internet and Technology. For much of his academic career, his focus was on law and technology, especially as it affects copyright. He wrote a number of wonderful books that deal with that subject. And now his current work is focusing on the question of institutional corruption. And that is his latest huge bestseller, Republic Lost, treats with that issue. It's very captivating, and it's certainly a call to arms, I think, in many ways. He's won more awards than you can shake a stick at. But they're exceptionally meaningful awards, and they speak to the difference he's making and the mountains that he's moved. One of the awards he's won is the Free Software Foundation's Freedom Award. And he was named one of Scientific American's top 50 visionaries. I admire so much the way that he is inspiring us and bringing us together and connecting us more deeply, and trying to resuscitate the original kind of ethos at our nation's founding, when what we had in common was far greater than any area of difference. And tonight he'll speak about the Constitution, the corrosive influence of money in politics, and I believe that was, again, feel more connected as a result of the conversation and the insights that I'll share tonight. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Lawrence Lessig.
So thank you, Chris, and thank you to this extraordinary celebration of our Constitution for giving me the opportunity to speak, and thank you for the bizarre idea that you would come out so late in the evening to hear a talk about our Constitution. It's a measure of the city, perhaps, but certainly of you, and I'm grateful that you're here. I want to start with a story, and I'm told stories begin like this. Once upon a time there was a place called Lesterland. Now, Chris didn't tell you because it's a secret, so I appreciate it if you don't tell anybody about this, but my first name is actually Lester, so I'm allowed to make fun of Lesters, and that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to tell you a story about a place called Lesterland. Lesterland looks a lot like the United States. Like the United States, it has about 311 million people, and like the United States, 144,000 of those people are named Lester. The internet told me that. It must be true. So that means about 0.05% of Lesterland is named Lester. Now, Lesters in Lesterland have a very interesting kind of power. Every election cycle in Lesterland, there are two elections. One they call the general election, and the second they call the Lester election. In the general election, it's the citizens who get to vote. In the Lester election, it's the Lesters who get to vote. But here's the catch. To be allowed to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. Okay, so Lesterland has a democracy, but what can we say about the democracy in Lesterland? What we can say, number one, is the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, the people of Lesterland have the ultimate influence over the elected officials, because after all, there is a general election. But they have that influence only after the Lesters have their way with the candidates who wish to run in the general election. And we can say, number two, obviously this dependence upon the Lesters is going to produce a subtle, understated, we could say camouflaged bending to keep the Lesters happy. Okay, so there's a democracy which is dependent upon the Lesters and dependent upon the people. Competing dependencies, maybe conflicting dependencies depending upon who the Lesters are. Okay, that's Lesterland. Now, there are three things I want you to recognize now that I've described for you Lesterland. Number one, the United States is Lesterland. The United States is Lesterland. The United States also looks like this, also has two elections. One of them is called the voting election, discrete. Every 2 years we go out and vote. The other we should call the money election. In the voting election, it's the citizens who get to vote if you're over 18, in some states if you have an ID. In the money election, it's the funders who get to vote. The funders who get to vote. And just like in the Lester election, to be allowed to run in the voting election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election, in the money election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. And here's the key. There are just as few relevant funders in USA land as there are Lesters in Lesterland. Now you say, really? 0.05%? Well, here are the numbers from 2010. 2010, 0.26% of Americans gave $200 or more to any federal candidate. Now you're thinking he's a lawyer, doesn't know how to do statistics, but I really mean 1/4% of Americans gave $200 or more. 0.05% gave the maximum amount allowed to any federal candidate. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, gave $10,000 or more in that election cycle, and in this cycle just ending, 0.000042%, those of you doing the numbers, you know that's 132 Americans, gave 60% of the super PAC money that was spent in the cycle just ending. So I'm a lawyer, I look at this range of numbers, 0.26 to 0.01. I think it's fair for me to say 0.05 is a fair estimate of the relevant funders, and in this sense, the funders are our Lesters. Okay. That's democracy in USA land. What can we say about this democracy? Well, we can say the Supreme Court was, of course, right. The people have the ultimate influence over elected officials, because after all, there is a voting election. But only after the funders have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces a subtle, understated, camouflaged bending to keep the funders happy. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And the question we need to think about is, what does it do to them as they spend their time dialing for dollars from the tiniest fraction of the 1%? I know many of you might remember this image of the Skinner box, this device created by B.F. Skinner to teach these animals what they need to do in order to get fed. And as they learn what they need to do in order to get fed, they become more and more focused on what they need to do in order to get fed. They develop this sixth sense, as members of Congress do. Members of Congress develop a sixth sense of constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their view in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is, here too is a democracy, one dependent upon the funders and dependent upon the people. Competing dependencies, maybe conflicting dependencies, depending upon who the funders are. Okay, that's the first point. The United States is Lesterland. Here's the second point. The United States is worse than Lesterland. Worse than Lesterland. Because you can imagine in Lesterland, if we Lesters got a letter from the government telling us that we got to pick who the candidates would be that would run in the next election. You know, there are Lesters from every single economic class. There are black Lesters, there are white Lesters. There aren't many women Lesters, but put that to one side for a second. There are all sorts of Lesters. It's at least conceivable that a kind of aristocracy of the Lesters would develop. We would begin to think, how could we act? What could we do to advance the interests of Lesterland? It's at least possible we would act for the good of Lesterland, because we don't have interests that are so divided that they would drive us in a separate way. But in our land, in this land, in USA land, though there are some sweet Lesters out there, the vast majority of the Lesters in this system act for the good of the Lesters. Because the shifting coalitions of people who comprise the 0.05% are not comprising those numbers to advance the public interest. It's not the public interest, it's their private interest that they use their power to push. In this sense, the USA is worse than Lesterland. And then point number 3. Whatever one wants to say about Lesterland against the background of its traditions, its constitution, its history, in our land, in this land, USA land, Lesterland is a corruption. A corruption. Now, by corruption, I don't mean cash secreted in brown paper bags to members of Congress to buy their votes. I don't mean Rob Blagojevich sense of corruption. I'm not talking about any criminal act. Indeed, I'm perfectly willing to stipulate everything I'm talking about is perfectly legal, indeed constitutionally protected. The activities I'm talking about are legal, yet they are a corruption relative to the framers' baseline for how this government was to function. The framers gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Federalist 52 puts it, a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. So here's the model of government. They have the people, they have the government. We're doing it on slides. It's a little bit that bounces like that, right? So the people and the government. And then the question, how would this dependence be assured? Madison answered in Federalist 52. It would be assured in these discrete elections by making them every single 2-year cycle. Frequent elections, Madison wrote, are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectively secured. So the people exclusively depended upon their government. But the problem is, we don't have that exclusive dependency anymore. Instead, we increasingly have a separate dependency, a dependence upon the funders. This is a dependence too. And it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. It is a corruption of their design, so long as the funders are not the people. Now, there's good news about this corruption. It's bipartisan, equal opportunity corruption. It blocks the left on issues the left cares about, from climate change to financial reform, but it also blocks the principled right from the right's ability to get the things that they say they want to do when the right is in power. So the right says it wants smaller government. When Al Gore was vice president, his team came up with a plan to deregulate a significant chunk of the telecommunications industry. They took this idea to Capitol Hill. The idea was churned over in Capitol Hill. The reaction that they got back from Capitol Hill was, hell no, as described to me by the policy guy who ran this project. Quote, if we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them? Thus putting a thumb on the scale against the idea of smaller government, because smaller government only increases the difficulty members of Congress might face to raise money. Or think about the right's objective of simpler tax system. Wall Street Journal in 2011 had this article about the rise of the temporary tax code, as they put it. The temporary tax code refers to all the provisions in the tax code that are set for narrow policy areas and then expire after a limited period of time. And this project of expirations and then extension produced what the journal called this extender mania, as the number of provisions that expire are going up, and then the number of extensions of those provisions go up. And the journal was puzzled about what explains this extender mania. Well, what explains it is exactly the dynamic you would expect if you think about a Congress focused in their Skinner box-like way on the project of raising money, as the Institute for Policy Innovation puts it, describing the research and development tax credit, a tax credit given to us by Ronald Reagan and made temporary originally so that they could test whether it would work or not. But a tax credit that 30 years later is still temporary. Why is it still temporary? Well, as this right-wing think tank puts it, this cycle has repeated itself for years. Congress allows the credit to lapse until another short extension is given, preceded, of course, by a series of fundraisers and speeches about the importance of nurturing innovation. Congress essentially uses this cycle to raise money for re-election, promising the industry the more predictability the next time around. So once again, if your objective is a simpler tax system, a thumb is on the scale against a simpler tax system because complexity makes it easier to raise money to fund your campaigns. This is a system designed to save the status quo, both against the reforms of the left and the right. And in this sense, you could say it's at least fair. This is the good news about this corruption. But the bad news about this corruption is that it's a pathological democracy-destroying kind of corruption. Because in any system where the tiniest fraction of the 1% has the power to direct this essential function of this election I call the money election, what that means is that the tiniest fraction of that tiniest fraction, I mean a really tiny, tiny fraction, has the capacity to block reform. And I should have found a rock, but I could only find a block of cheese. But so here it is. Block reform.
Yeah, I just ate it.
And they can do that because there is an economy of influence that operates within the beltway of DC, an economy where each component is dependent upon this system surviving. And indeed, each component benefits the more dysfunctional the system becomes. This feeds on polarization. It feeds on dysfunction, because the more dysfunctional it becomes, the easier it is for those who sell policy to sell the objective of blocking reform. So the worse it is for us, the better it becomes for the project of fundraising. For fundraising, for God's sake, to think about the idea that the structure of the way our government functions is driven by this is astonishing. And it reminds me, it focuses me on the words of Henry David Thoreau. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, to one who is striking at the root. This story should drive us to this root. It should drive us to think about how we may become Rootstrikers here. Okay, now, everyone here knows what I just said. Everyone knows this fact about our government. Yet we systematically ignore it. We ignore it because focusing on solving that problem seems to us just impossible. So we as a society focus on the possible problems. Problems like what Bill Gates does to eradicate the world of polio, or what Google does to take an image of every single street all across the globe, or what Microsoft is doing to build a truly universal translator, the sort that Captain Kirk used to talk about Klingons. These are the manageable problems for us. And so we ignore the really impossible problems, like dealing with the government's corruption. But my plea to you tonight is we cannot ignore this problem anymore, because we need a government that works. I was at the TED conference, and Jennifer Granholm, former governor from Michigan, gave an extraordinary speech about the need for energy policy. And she said the number one most successful policy change that Obama brought about was actually in education. The reason it was so successful was that he created a race to the top, a fund that would reward states for developing better education policies. And it created enormous change in how education was done. So she said, we need a race to the top for energy policy. We need a fund, like a $5 billion fund. And that $5 billion fund would inspire states to do what they could to bring about good energy policy. I was with her all the way until she got to the very end. And she said, but of course the government will never do this. The government has no capacity to actually do something sensible in this space. So we need to kickstart our own project. And she turned to the TED audience, and she, in the TED audience, was asking people to pledge $5 billion to fund her project. And I was astonished. I felt like a kick in the gut. I thought, are we a third world nation? Are we a third world nation? The idea that you would be funding an energy policy by pleading hand in hand to the richest people in the country? We need a government that works. We can't rely upon a system where we're depending upon private people to lend their support to essential governmental functions. So work, but not work for the left or the right, but work for the left and right, for the citizens of the left and right who have reform that's sensible and win elections that give them the right to demand it. Because here's the thing to recognize. There will be no sensible reform on the left or the right until we end this corruption. So, grab the issue you care most about. Sit it down in front of you, look it straight in the eyes, and explain to it that there will be no Christmas for that issue until we fix this reform. My issue is global warming, but yours might be financial reform, or inequality, or a healthcare system that makes sense, or tax simplification, whatever the issue is. You need to accept the fact we will get no sensible progress on that issue until we fix this issue first. So it's not that mine is the most important issue. It's not. Yours is the most important issue. Mine is the first issue. The issue we need to solve if we're going to make it possible for this government to address the issues that you care about most. No sensible reform, and we cannot afford a nation that's incapable of sensible reform. Okay, so how can we bring about this change? what would make it work? Well, the analytics here are pretty easy. If the problem is a system, the Skinner box system, where candidates spend an extraordinary amount of time fundraising from the tiniest slice of America, then the solution to that problem is a system where candidates spend less time, but they raise their money from the wider slice of America. So they're not dependent on the 0.05% on the Lesters, but they are dependent on a wider slice of America. To spread out the funder's influence so that it approximates the ideal Madison described when he said a system dependent upon the people alone. And to do this, I don't believe we need to amend the Constitution. Indeed, a single statute that would establish small dollar funded elections, what I call citizen funded campaigns, where candidates voluntarily opt into taking small contributions only, but the system magnifies those so that those small contributions make it feasible to win a campaign. That would change the system. So ideas such as the Fair Elections Now Act, which in 2010 came within 20 votes of passing in the House, or something Represent Us is pushing now called the American Anti-Corruption Act, which has a $100 tax credit that could be used to fund small dollar funded campaigns. Or in my book for public laws, I described something called the Grant and Franklin Project, where every voter would get a tax rebate of $50 in the form of a democracy voucher. And with that voucher, you could give it to any campaign that agrees to fund their campaign with $50 vouchers plus contributions maxed out at $100, Grant and Franklin. $50 to every voter would be $7 billion, which is 3 times the total amount raised and spent in the last congressional campaign. Or Congressman John Sarbanes, a Democrat from Maryland, has a proposal which wraps all 3 of these together. He calls it the Grassroots Democracy Act, which has a matching grant project like the Fair Elections Now Act, as the tax credit proposal, and as a pilot for a voucher project. Each of these would achieve the objective. Each of them would fix this corruption of the current system, where the top 1% per capita has 10 times the influence of the bottom 99% together. And it would push us towards a system where the influence was more broadly spread across the public to get back to a system dependent upon the people alone. The analytics here are easy. It's the politics that's hard. Indeed, maybe impossibly hard. Because the reality is the reform I'm talking about would radically shrink the power of K Street where the lobbyists work. And Capitol Hill has become, as Congressman Jim Cooper describes, a Democrat from Tennessee who has been in Congress since 1982, Congress has become a kind of farm league for K Street. A farm league for K Street. And his point is that members and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model in their head. A business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of the Senate left to become lobbyists, 42% of the House. Those numbers have only gone up. And United Republic calculated last April for those members who they followed, the average salary increase was 1,452%. So in a system where everyone within the Beltway is depending upon K Street for their retirement, it's a fair question to ask, how is it possible that we imagine them changing this system? Now, I get the skepticism, the cynicism, the pessimism about the ability to address successfully this problem. I get it, but I don't buy it. In my view, this is an eminently solvable problem. Indeed, if you think about the problem that my parents and grandparents were focused on in the 20th century, those problems like racism or equality, or the problems that we're fighting right now around homophobia, those were hard problems. You don't just wake up one day no longer a racist. It takes generations to rip that instinct out of the DNA of a social community. But this problem of corruption is just a problem of incentives. It's just incentives. If you change the structure the behavior changes. So the 3 states, which have adopted small dollar funding systems for their state legislatures, Arizona, Maine, and Connecticut, have seen a radical change in the behavior of how people fund their elections. In Connecticut, in the first year, 78% of the elected representatives opted into a system where they took small dollar contributions only and raised no money in large contributions from the Connecticut Lesters. This is a solvable problem. But it's not solvable focusing on it as a Democrat or focusing on it as a Republican. It's solvable only if we can revive a sense of citizens demanding the problem change. Indeed, as I sat there and listened to Jennifer Granholm talk to Tedisons about how they could kickstart reform, I wanted to scream, geez, for half the price of your project to fund an energy policy, we could get us, again, a republic. For $2 billion, we could run a campaign to fix this system. It is solvable. But it's solvable if, and this is a big if, we can escape a certain trap that we as a people find ourselves in. The Chaturadic tell us that the interesting division in American politics is between the left side and the right side. But I think the really interesting division in American politics is actually between the inside and the outside. And this outside perspective, this outside of the Beltway, lives and flourishes despite the craziness that happens on the inside. It reminds you of that wonderful title of the book by John Gray. DC is from Mars, we could say, remixing this a bit, and we are from Earth. So this outside has its own politics, and we could call it, following Nigel Cameron, a kind of exopolitics. Exopolitics. And what exopolitics is not politics of politicians. They're not politician wannabes. Instead, it's citizen politics. It's citizen engaging in a way that demands that their politics change. And if you look back over the last 15 years, we've seen repeated waves of open source, self-described open source energy pushing citizen politics forward. Many of these, and they are becoming, I think, increasingly frequent. I think the first of these is 1998, when MoveOn was started by a couple of programmers from Berkeley who looked up from their screen one day and recognized that the United States Congress was about to impeach a man for lying about having sex. And they said, look, this is a problem, but it's nowhere on the list of the top 1,000 problems the United States is facing. So we need to build a movement to demand that Congress move on from this craziness. And so they started a list with a special technology. We, in a couple of weeks, had millions of people who had joined, demanding that Congress move on, censure the president, and move on, Republicans and Democrats alike, and it had an enormous impact in forcing Congress to change their focus and resolve this more quickly than otherwise it seemed they were going to do. I think the Tea Party movement, in parts, in 2009, was a kind of exo-political movement. People using the infrastructure of the net to organize these protests from around the country against policies they strongly objected to. Of course, I believe it was then captured by a traditional Beltway Republican focus, but it begins exactly as this exo-political movement. I think the Occupy movement was an exo-political movement that could take advantage of the infrastructure of the net to produce a kind of recognition and motivation for people to become involved, to reframe a debate about what was important in America and focus it once again on issues of equality. I think the extraordinary movement that stopped Hollywood for the first time in the history of the 20th century and the 21st century from enacting crazy, extreme copyright regulations, the limits that were to be put in this bill called SOPA, was a kind of exo-political movement that succeeded because it could call upon a recognition of thousands of people across the country to get them to focus their energy in forcing Congress to change. This is power, but it comes from the ground up. And I think it's something new. Some think it's something new. And if there's hope here, in my view, the hope comes from this exo-political movement. But here's the problem with this movement. Exopolitics, historically, only ever works if it's cross-partisan. by which I don't mean bipartisan. I mean instead a movement that cuts across partisan lines. Cuts across partisan lines. Indeed, if you think about the progressive movement of a century ago, many people think of progressives as liberals or leftists, but the progressives of a century ago came from across the political spectrum. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was elected as a Republican. Bob La Follette, who started the National Republican Progressive League, was a Republican. Republicans and Democrats who moved and worked together on many different projects, but aiming at reforming democracy so as to fight the special interests which they believed had corrupted their democracy. It was only because they could speak in a way that was not identified with one side of the political debate that they could eventually achieve a victory in 1912 where 70% of Americans voted for a candidate who called himself a progressive. So it has to be a cross-partisan movement to have this grassroots effective change. But the problem we face here is the exopolitical movement we see today has become extremely polarized. Like everyone in our society, politicians, political parties, the media, the organizations that are trying to organize us to fix our republic, they all practice this business model of polarization. A business model where everyone profits the more we divide ourselves, the more we teach us to hate them. We become a kind of Ray-Ban culture, polarized but very, very cool. That's who we are. But here's the problem. This is the problem with this. The problem with this polarization is that it leaves us no place, us as in we the people, no place to stand, no place to dance. It leaves us no place to do anything because no one trusts anyone who would advance the ideas for change. There is no entity in our society which has that trust. Claris did a study of Congress and the reforms that Congress have done around the problems of corruption. 80% of Americans affirmed all of those reforms have been designed more to help current members of Congress get reelected than to improve the system. This institution is an institution which we don't trust to tell us how to fix it, and so therefore we wouldn't turn to it to give us the ideas about what change is required. We don't trust law professors in this. We don't trust the church in this. We don't trust the Democrats or the Republicans. We don't trust Stephen Colbert, and then we do trust Stephen Colbert. But what this means is that even if one of these entities came up with a solution, it would not be viewed as a solution. It would be viewed as just a partisan idea from whatever partisan entity advanced it. And what we need now are solutions viewed as solutions. So there's that problem I was thinking about when I was asked to testify in the Senate last summer about the question of Citizens United. And I said to the 3 senators who show up to a hearing about Citizens United, well, there were 5. Okay. The 5 senators who showed up to it, I said, the biggest problem you face is not what the amendment to the Constitution should look like. It's convincing America that your amendment would actually do any good because we don't trust you. So what you should do is you should try to call upon us. A kind of project inspired by the type of work that Chris has done across the country. A project that tries to find a way for us to trust us again. So I described this project what I call citizen conventions. The idea of citizen conventions builds upon an extremely old idea in the American tradition, the idea of the jury. If you think about the jury, our Constitution embeds the power of the jury in very important ways. The grand jury must agree with the prosecutor before the prosecutor is allowed to prosecute one of us. It's a defense between the government and the people. You have to get a representative of the people to agree before the government is allowed to prosecute one of us. Same thing with the petit jury. It's a defense between the people and the government. You have to get a representative of the people to agree before you're allowed to send one of us to jail. These are extremely important checks on the power of a government. I don't think they've been upheld as that check over the 225 years since our Constitution was drafted, but that was the idea of the framers. And these institutions did their work by listening to arguments and listening to evidence and deliberating about what was presented to them and then exercising what is in effect government power. Indeed, very profound government power, because obviously a jury, at least in some states, can decide to execute somebody on the basis of their judgment of the weight of the evidence given to them by lawyers inside of an argument. So this idea of the jury is the kernel, but I want to think about the jury in a much bigger way. Because the juries that we have right now are too small to actually represent us. What we know from statistics is that for a jury to represent us, it would have to be significantly bigger. So imagine a kind of jury that was 400 people, randomly selected. Indeed, I want to think of them as drafted. You get a letter from the government. You also get compensation and protection from your job, but you get a letter from the government that says you will serve on this citizen convention jury. Randomly selected and representative. So we structure the selection process so that we have the right breakdown between men and women, between minorities and majorities in the population. So it's representative and randomly selected. And they're brought together and they're given evidence about the problem we're talking about. And the problem I'm talking about is the corruption and lack of trust inside of our system. They're given evidence and they're given a chance to deliberate. Whether it's a week or 2 weeks, I don't know how long it should be, but the point is they're given a serious opportunity to listen and to understand through this process called these citizen conventions. And imagine we ran 4 of them across the country. Different regions, perhaps, but 4 of them in sequence, each of them given the same body of information and a chance to deliberate on it, and asked each of them to answer these 2 questions. Number 1, is there a problem the government needs to address? Is this lack of confidence, this lack of trust, something we need to fix? And if there is a problem, how do we fix it? What is the answer to fix it? And once they come up with these proposals, let them then make this institution listen to these ideas and respond. So an independent body, in the sense of non-dependent body, that would have the capacity to deliberate representative selection of us and make a judgment about how to move forward, about the best ideas for fixing the system. Now, I hail from the elite in our legal system. I teach at the Harvard Law School. But I am 100% certain that if we had a properly selected group of ordinary citizens, representative, randomly selected, given the information and a chance to fairly deliberate, they would come up with proposals for change miles above anything the United States Congress has ever thought of. Now that's a low bar, I recognize, but still. It's the highest bar we have in our system right now, and I think we the people have the capacity to do that, and part of the evidence for that is the work that Christopher has done, and part of the evidence is our own tradition that said from the very start, core critical powers and decisions of the government shall be vested in these randomly selected bodies that have the capacity to deliberate and make those judgments. My view is we need to at least experiment. Experiment with this project, which here is called a sortition project. Sortition, we randomly select people to see that if we sort well inside of this experiment, if we can produce ideas that merit the attention and the confidence of the people. And we need more of this experimentation inside of our current democracy to find a way out of the corner we've painted ourselves into, where there is no institution we trust, no institution that could tell us what the answers are, no institution we would rally around. We need experimentation to find it. And in this, I'm inspired by a friend of mine who committed suicide about 10 weeks ago, Aaron Swartz, whose slogan was, "The revolution will be A/B tested." A/B tested. A/B testing is what websites do when they put up a new site. They run one set of people on one version, another set of people on the other, and they see which one works, committed fundamentally to empirically seeing which design delivers the objective of the reform effort. And that's what we've got to be committed to here. To test, to try, to work extremely hard, to find a way to build the power necessary to take on this most powerful policy-making body that there is in our democracy, K Street, and to win. I think it's solvable. I think it's possible to organize to make it solvable, not by organizing to become the Borg, one large organization that tries to speak for the people, but instead many different kinds of organizations. Many different organizations, as the progressives had many different organizations. But the only frame that I think could actually unite people like this with people like this is the frame of corruption. It's the only grammar that both sides would affirm and stand and cheer to defeat. It's certainly not this frame that would unite the American people. It unites corners of the American people, typically on the coasts, but not across the country. This is not a frame America will embrace. The frame they will embrace is one that focuses on a principle so deep in all of our traditions that we recognize it as a common ground, this corruption of the system. And that's the objective of the site, the organization that I helped found about 2 years ago, Rootstrikers. And I'm very proud of the Philly Rootstrikers chapter, which has done extraordinary work to spread this idea and this recognition. Rootstrikers have as their objective the aim that Thoreau spoke of, to bring more people around, to recognizing the root and stop hacking at the branches, to teach and then to spread this common understanding so that we have a potential in the people to actually do something about it. I think it's solvable. But as hard as I work to convince people it's solvable, they're still met all the time with the reaction, rolling your eyes, saying, no, it's not solvable. It's impossible. The power that we're up against is so entrenched. And the incapacity that we have to pull together is so significant that we can't possibly overcome this problem. But what I've recognized over the last 5 years as I've gone around the country talking about this issue is, even if it's not solvable, even if you believe it's impossible, that should be irrelevant to how you think about this issue. And I first had this recognition in a story that I tell at the end of my book, Republic Lost, where I was speaking at Dartmouth and a woman raised her hand after that talk and she said, "Professor, you've convinced me. It's hopeless. There's nothing we can do." And when she said that, I struggled to think, well, what could I possibly say in response? And I had in my head an image that came to me of my then 6-year-old son. And the image was of my son sitting there as a doctor was explaining to me that your son has terminal brain cancer. And there's nothing you can do. Nothing you can do. And the question was, would I do nothing? Sit there and accept the sentence? Nothing I can do? And of course, what I recognized at that moment was, no, of course, you would do everything you could do. That love means, the odds be damned, you do whatever you possibly can in the name of that love. And it was a short step from that recognition to the obvious link, which is, even we liberals love our country. Even we liberals love our country. And so when the politicians and pundits tell us that this is impossible, this problem is impossible, just give up, what the response should be is, that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. What love means is to do whatever the hell you can, the odds be damned. Because what we know is that we all recognize we lose something dear, something we all love and cherish, if we lose the traditions that this republic gave us. And so we act with everything we can to prove those pundits wrong. So here's the question. Do you have that love? Do you have that love? Because if you do, what the hell are you? What the hell are we doing? When Ben Franklin was carried from the Constitutional Convention just across the mall in September of 1787, he was stopped by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" Franklin said, "A republic, madam, a republic, if you can keep it. A republic, a representative democracy, a government dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic." All of us have to act. All of us have to act as citizens now to get it back. Thank you very much.
That was so inspiring. Larry, can you talk a little bit more about the Citizens Convention? It's not necessarily something that would lead to dramatic constitutional overhaul.
No, that's right. So there's I kind of think of three convention-like activities that are happening. One is what you're doing. As you go around the country and gather groups of 20, last night we had probably 50 people in a room who work through understanding our existing Constitution and talk about how to make it something better. That's an essential part of this process. So it's completely ordinary for people to think in that way. And the other extreme is what Article 5 gives us, called the Constitutional Article 5 Convention, which is not technically a constitutional convention. Constitutional convention, in theory, has the power just to rip up the document and start over. It's a convention called pursuant to Article 5 that has only the power to propose amendments to the Constitution, which then have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And I actually believe that the convention might be an essential step to bringing about the kind of reform that I care about. Now, that talk terrifies people. Most people are afraid of the idea of the convention. They're convinced of the convention. It's the one thing that unites the far left and the far right. The Birchers are convinced that fluoride in the Constitutional Convention will bring us to Marxism in America. Those two essential threats have to be fought against. And the far left, is reasonably fearful of losing fundamental rights inside the Constitution. And so you have to accept the reality that people are terrified about the convention. But the point I was trying to make in the testimony was that there's a middle position here. You can imagine creating, in effect, a convention informed by ordinary citizens, properly constituted. It would have no legal power. It would just be like advice to the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Senate Judiciary Committee could set it up, could say, please address this question. We run this 4 times around the country. And in the process of doing that, we bring out, call into being a life that could speak in a way that isn't tarred by being from one side or the other, or being interested in driving ratings on MSNBC or Fox News, right? It would be something different. And my point is we should at least try to create that for the purpose of giving us something else on the table that we can be arguing about. And at least a possibility of mobilizing around something that isn't just pushed from one side or pushed from the other.
So approaching this from a lot of different directions.
Absolutely, it's essential.
So my understanding, but it would also, if we ever did at least seem to be close to calling such a convention, it might actually get the institutions of power quicker.
Well, that's right. So the last time we came really close to a convention was 100 years ago. The Senate, 101 years ago, the Senate was still selected by the state legislatures. And because it was selected by the state legislatures, it was a target for corruption. People was basically buying their Senate seats. That doesn't happen anymore, but back then they would buy their Senate seats. But they would buy their Senate seats in the old-fashioned form of corruption. They would just basically pay legislators. Today you buy it in the new-fashioned form of corruption. You set up their super PAC or whatever. But But they would buy Senate seats, and people believed the only way to make democracy work was to end that corruption. So they started calling on the Senate to make itself popularly elected. The progressive general solution to corruption was direct democracy, or some version of that. But the Senate wasn't about to bring about that change. So for years, this idea lay without anybody actually picking it up. So then there was the beginning of a project to get Congress to call a convention. And they came within one state of having enough votes to force Congress to call an Article 5 convention. And then Congress is terrified. They're like, you know, what is that convention going to do? We can't imagine this sort of entity being created that has the power to trump us. So very quickly, they sent out the 17th Amendment, which is the amendment that gave us the direct election of senators. And it passed very quickly around the states. And in 1913, it became the law. But it was inspired in part by the threat of a convention. So yes, I believe if we even got to 20 or 25 states calling for an Article 5 convention, that would put real pressure on Congress to address the issue. And my view is this is a much more effective strategy than the strategy many reformers have taken, where they've gone to state legislatures and they've said, please pass a resolution demanding that Congress propose an amendment to address Citizens United or whatever issue you care about. Because of course, Congress gets these resolutions, they file them in their circular file cabinets, and they ignore them. It has no legal consequence. But states that began to count the ticker down to the number necessary to get a convention mandated would be real pressure on the system to bring about change.
What would our economy look like if we ever significantly did away with this dependence corruption?
Well, one of the most important things not to hear when you hear somebody like me talk about this is, first of all, so I created these creatures called the Lesters. The Lesters are not the rich. I mean, they are rich, but the vast majority of rich people have never given to any political campaign. The vast majority of rich people don't want to spend any time with politicians. I'm not talking about the rich. I'm talking about people who wanted to use their power, which they happen to have because they're rich, to steer the democracy in a particular way. And I think to corrupt the democracy in a particular way. Not all of them. Some of them use their money to do things that can't possibly benefit them. So my hero at the end of this book is a guy named Arnold Hyatt, who in 1996 was the second largest contributor to Democratic campaigns. And he had this, he was then invited by Bill Clinton to a dinner of 30 fat cats where they sat around talking about what Bill Clinton should do in the second term. This was before the Lewinsky scandal, so that the concept of a second term was meaningful for Bill Clinton at that point. Each of them got up and told the president what the president should do, and Arnold was the last one to speak, and he stood up and he said, Mr. President, I know you admire Franklin Roosevelt. You need to put yourselves in Franklin Roosevelt's shoes in 1939, I guess was what he said, 39, when Roosevelt recognized he needed to convince the American people to wage a war to save democracy. Because he said, Mr. President, that's what you need. You need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. But not a war against fascists, a war against fat cats, people like us. People who believe that merely because we're rich, we have the right to get the president on the other end of the telephone line, or a senator on the other. People who've used their power to steer democracy in a way that makes it so that people don't believe in democracy. And that's what he spent his money for. He funded every single campaign he could by people who committed to bringing about citizen-funded elections. Now, when he did this, of course, you can imagine in that small room, there was silence as everybody looked at each other. A little bit of embarrassment. People didn't know what to say. And the only published account we have of that evening says that President Clinton ripped Arnold Hyatt to shreds, humiliating him in front of the rest of the group. We didn't come to power in order to give up power, blah, blah, blah. But, there's a Lester exercising his power in a way that's not about making himself better off. It's about trying to make democracy better off. So there are plenty of Lesters like that. But the Lesters I'm talking about are using their influence to benefit their special interests. And they should be opposed by not only the rich, but also by capitalists. Right? I'm not talking about capitalists either, but because most capitalists want to make their money the old-fashioned way. They want to go out and find new innovations that create jobs and make great returns for their shareholders. But increasingly, capitalists are faced with this very difficult choice. There's this cottage industry among economists that now uses records about lobbying to calculate the return on investment from lobbying. Because you can see that you have to report what you're lobbying for. You can see whether that bill passed. You can see how much the bill was worth to that company. You compare how much you spent on lobbying versus how much it was worth. That's a return on investment. And these returns on investments are astronomical. They're in the hundreds, thousands. There's one paper from Kansas that points to this statute where the return on investment was 22,000%. So you can imagine a capitalist sitting there and, head of research and development says to her, if you invest in this new widget, you'll make a 30% return or a 40% return. And then the head from the lobbying shop says, if you invest in more lobbying, you'll make a 100% return or a 200% return. And what is the CEO supposed to do? Of course, you're going to invest your money where you make the highest return. So more and more money gets devoted to the project of persuading Congress or persuading the administration to do what might benefit the special interests of that company as opposed to the project of doing what capitalists are supposed to do. So one of my heroes in this movement is a libertarian economist from Chicago named Luigi Zingales, who wrote a great book called Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. And his whole point was what capitalists do is once they succeed, they try to corrupt the government to protect themselves from the next generation of competitors. And that's how capitalism works. So the only way to save capitalism is to completely make it impossible for them to take over government. And you only make that possible, in my view, if you spread out the fund of influence. So capitalists should be in favor of this, and if we did this, I think the economy would be much more robust, much greater growth, focused on the sort of things that economists are supposed to worry about. Delivering products that people want, as opposed to finding ways to convince the rats in that Skinner box that the particular benefit through a tax loophole would be worth it to them because of the fundraising they have.
So you equated the citizens' conventions with juries. And juries ain't what they used to be. People can get out of jury duty pretty much if they want to. It's typically not a jury of one's peers. Through statutes now, trial lawyers can handle this summarily, eliminated anybody that they want to up to a certain amount. How do we kind of recapture that sort of sense that these are really not just those who are already actively involved? And so, in other words, so if you're called to serve on this, you don't want to opt out.
Yeah, well, right. That's really critical. I mean, juries are imperfect institutions today, both because they are not actual random selections of anybody. They're very biased because of the way lawyers act with them, and also because of the ability of people to get out of them. So they're not random. They're not big enough to be representative of anything. So it was a great idea if that's what its idea was, but it's actually been implemented in a very bad way. So that's why I'm talking about a large body that is randomly selected. Now, you've got to make it so that people participate. And you do that, I think the only way this works is if there's a statute in Congress that creates this, that creates protection for people from their jobs, that compensates them so it's not a burden, but basically drafts stuff, right? We used to draft people to go off and fight wars, and risk their lives for months at a time. This is, a couple weeks. That's all we're asking. You've got to come serve. Because it's not a fair representation of America if we're just talking about the politically active people who would want to show up to such a jury. Because what we know is America is not polarized. If you talk about all Americans follow a very standard bell curve distribution of political attitudes. It's the politically active class that's polarized. And that's a very small subset of America. And the politically active class is what's helping to push this polarization, increase this polarization, as they are played, in my view, to help them to raise money. So I think that the objective here has got to be to make sure that we have a real cross-section of America, and then give them a chance to actually know enough to be able to say something about it. Now, I recognize, as I said last night, 90 5% of the sane people who hear me say this think that I'm crazy. The crazy people love what I say, but these sane people think that this idea is just crazy. And I understand why people are skeptical of ordinary people, because most people don't know anything about government. They don't know anything about the Constitution. They don't know anything about what politics means or should mean. But I think we have to cut people some slack here. Why would you waste your time if you were rational? Unlike people like you and me who are politically active, really engaged. But if you were rational, why would you waste your time paying attention to government? If you live in Lesterland, which we do, why would you, if you're not a Lester, care about what government does? Because you understand that the agenda has been framed, has been set by Lesters, and the rest of us basically have a very small choice within that narrow frame. So people are rationally ignorant about the system. They're not stupid. They're very smart about whatever else they care about. And my own view, as somebody who's been teaching constitutional law for 20 years, is this is not rocket science. This is not incredibly difficult to get people to recognize enough to have an intuition about what the right kind of answer is. And this is one of these rare sports where the amateur is better than the professional. Because the thing I'm afraid of when people talk about a convention, Article 5 convention, is that it would be populated by a bunch of politicians. Politicians are professionals. They have an instinct about how what they do will affect their funders or their supporters. So they're constantly focused on how to do what benefits their base the most. But the amateur doesn't have that skill. The amateur, if you can get them in the right context to think about these issues in the right way, begins to think about what's actually in the interest of America. Because, that's not going to affect the person directly. They're called upon to think what's in the interest of the country. And they can actually develop a sense of the public good more easily than the people who have lived in the Skinner box of American politics and have learned how to focus on just their own private special interests.
So you teach at Harvard, I'm teaching at Penn right now. What role do universities have to play in bringing this to fruition? Because it seems that they sort of have a kind of dependence corruption too. They're always trying to raise lots and lots of money. There was something in the New York Times just a couple days ago about how the high achievers in high school, the lowest 1/4 income strata, do not even apply to the top 238 colleges or so. And that has ramifications for this as well. What can and should universities be doing? Colleges be doing?
Well, I think universities. So I run the center at Harvard focused on what we call institutional corruption. What I've described tonight is institutional corruption in Congress. But you can recognize that same pattern of corruption for all of the great institutions in our society. The academy is, right at the top. So, doctors taking money from drug companies but sitting on panels that review drugs. Academics taking money to give public testimony about what's in the public good, when in fact their check is being written by somebody who has a very distinct interest. So you look at all of these institutions and recognize the way in which we've allowed them to become responsive to interests that are not actually the interests the institution is supposed to serve. So I think the academy's got to worry about that problem quite significantly for its own set of concerns about maintaining the integrity of the academy. But I think there's a positive role the academy can play in trying to push, kind of being the midwife to this project of getting America into the place where they understand what's at stake and how to address it. What we talked about today at lunch was trying to start this project of citizen conventions at universities. Like pick 5 large universities across the country. Community college university, a state university, an Ivy League university, and randomly select within those universities 300 students and force them into the project of this deliberation and see what comes out of it. And I would bet, if I had money this would be meaningful, but I would bet all the money I have that these different universities would come up with essentially the same kinds of solutions despite their differences, despite the differences in the abilities and the demographics of these students. And that itself would begin to get people to recognize that maybe there's something that we can summon if only we form it in the right way. So this, I think, might be a step towards getting to the place that we could do this.
So you have 3 young children. I have a 6.5-year-old and another bambino on the way. It's my wife, Ceci's United. Are we really doing this for them? I mean, if we don't do this for the next generation, what does this say about us?
Yeah, I mean, I feel this profoundly because, I feel like when I was just coming to age, I felt like we had inherited, not a perfect democracy, but we'd inherited a pretty powerful nation. When I was a kid, I was a Republican. I was the youngest member of the delegation in the 1980 convention. Elected Ronald Reagan as the nominee. So I had a particularly, I grew up, I'm not a Republican anymore, but I had a particularly romantic conception of, who we were and what we stood for. And I would be embarrassed to try to justify it to my children, who are now too young. I don't have to worry about justifying it to them yet. What we've done in the last 30 years, what this nation, what we've lost in the last 30 years. And it's really important for people to recognize that the corruption I'm talking about is really just 20 years old. The radical change in how the institution of government functions happens not because of Ronald Reagan, it happens in the 1990s in this conspiracy between the Democrats and the Republicans as they race to be competitive with each other and raise as much money as they possibly could. That's when the institution of Congress radically changed.
That's the most stunning revelation of all, that it's been such a short period of time.
Yeah. But, it's been recent, just at the moment when we need the capacity to make really important judgments about whether it's climate change or healthcare or debt or equality, just at the time we need that capacity, and we've lost the capacity. We're just a stalemate nation by design, because the more stalemated it is, the more opportunities there are to sell to people who want to buy policy with the ability to block change.
Well, I want to open up for a little bit to folks in the audience. And so I think we can just hear you. Yes, sir.
Just one question. In light of I think democracy, real blow to democracy in light of the recent Supreme Court decision where they ruled in favor of unlimited campaign contributions. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so you'll notice I just mentioned Citizens United. That was the decision twice in my talk. Because I think reformers are too obsessed with the Supreme Court and too obsessed with that decision. And the reason I think so is, if we could go back to January 20th, 2010, the day before Citizens United was decided, we need to recognize our democracy was already broken. Citizens United may have shocked the body, but the body was already cold. Right? So if you build a reform movement whose objective is to overturn Citizens United and get us back to January 20th, 2010, you would have achieved nothing. Because we still would have a world of Westerland. We still would have the tiniest fraction of the 1% funding elections. Now, Citizens United made it much worse, no doubt. You only get the 132 funding 60% of super PACs because of Citizens United. But we need to recognize the problem here is not Citizens United. It's Citizens United exacerbating the problem of funding from the tiniest fraction of 1%. And so we need to build recognition for addressing that core problem. And if we address that core problem, we would build the support necessary to take on the consequences of Citizens United. Now, I'd go back and forth with whether we need to actually take on Citizens United. Because, I actually think this opinion cannot survive. Supreme Court, there's very old judges in that majority. By the next administration, they're going to be gone, at least 2 of them. If the next administration appoints more moderate judges, I think that opinion in the line of that decision is just not long for this world. So again, I don't want to waste a reform movement on what time is going to give us anyway. And I actually don't even think the Supreme Court has yet ruled on the really important question of whether you can limit super PACs. All that the Supreme Court said was that individuals and corporations could spend their own money on their own speech. They haven't yet addressed the question whether you can limit contributions to what is an independent political action committee. The DC Circuit, in the case called Speech Now, thought that followed automatically. The Supreme Court didn't review that case, but I don't think it follows on that. So it might be we can address the problem of Citizens United without a constitutional amendment. But I think the more important point is whether we want a constitutional amendment or not, the first thing we have to focus on is addressing this underlying corruption. And we can do that just through a statute. And if we had a statute, we could begin down the road to getting back some reason to trust it.
Yes. You, right there.
I have a friend who's very excited about democracy, and I am too. And he's very excited because it's every so many years we have elections, which he says is a non-violent revolution. I immediately have two responses to that. The first is, technically it's not a revolution, it's a palace revolution, where the government does not change, but the faces change. Which leads to the second point, is that it feels like the politicians have, as you alluded to, common agendas. So that Congress is really not a group of individuals, but it is one individual, not only in a certain amount of time, but also throughout time. It seems the agenda is perpetuated. So I'm excited about exopolitics and this convention. But what reform to the congressional agenda would you propose?
Well, so if you think that the problem with Congress is it's filled with a bunch of criminals, then what I've talked about isn't a reform at all. But if you believe with me that the problem with Congress is just that they're forced into a life, if they want to stay, they're forced, nobody forces you to be a congressperson, but they're forced into a life if they want to stay, of the Skinner box of raising money from the tiniest fraction of 1%, and that can't help but bend you in a way that makes it impossible for real reform to happen. Then if you change the way you fund elections, you change that character of the system. Because what happens, so just think about the steps in the economics here. If you change the way you fund elections, K Street is not valuable anymore. You still need lobbyists. I think lobbyists perform an essential function inside of our republic. Just informing the government about the consequence of their regulation. That's really essential because the government is clueless about the consequence of their regulation. But as John Edwards used to say when we used to quote John Edwards, there's all the difference in the world between a lawyer making argument to a jury and a lawyer handing out $100 bills to the jurors. And what we've got right now is a lobbying system more like handing $100 bills out to the jurors than a lobbying system of lawyers making arguments to juries. So if we change the way we fund, those lobbyists wouldn't be as powerful because it doesn't pay to pay them $1 million salaries because they can't actually deliver anything for those salaries anymore because Congress doesn't have to do what they want them to do because Congress's funding is coming from somebody else. So the lobbying system changes and you give Congress at least a chance to become independent again. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not looking for utopia. I don't believe we get to a place where we have a perfect democracy and everybody hums kumbaya together. That's not worth aiming for because that's never going to happen. But we do get to a place where it's at least possible for Congresses to do things like the Congresses did in the 1980s and 1970s and 1960s. What made Ronald Reagan's presidency so successful was not a right-wing crazy who stood at the far extreme of the political spectrum and lectured the rest of America. What made his administration successful was that he struck deals with the Democrats. It was the tax package, especially the 1986 tax package, which was a fundamental reform to the tax system that only happened because he could sit down with the other side and figure out how to do something, how to govern. The 1970s gave us, it's Nixon who gave us the EPA. It's an astonishing thing to recognize. Nixon who gave us the EPA. And an incredible part of, bureaucracy in Washington was aiming at real problems. In the 1960s, it gave us the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. These were major abilities of Congress to finally sit down and focus on a problem and deal with it, that we could not begin to hope for. So I think that if you just change the economy of how they live, you at least make it possible for imperfect government to happen. Right now we have not even the possibility of imperfect government to happen. We just have stalemate government, which we just can't afford to. We can't live with.
Yes, Jerry.
Yeah, I like your idea. I think it is solvable. It would depend on the citizenry. But as a federal employee, I could not accept a gift or money of any kind. And my job wasn't nearly as important as that of a lawmaker or a congressman. Let's make this simple. A contribution is a bribe. No bribes are allowed.
Yeah, so I think the problem with that, as a solution, is that campaigns cost money. Money cost campaigns too. Campaigns cost money. And so, the reform efforts for the last 30 years have all been focused upon how do we quash down the money in politics? How do we get rid of it? How do we drive it out? So we can get rid of soft money, try to get rid of corporate money, but the Supreme Court will return that. And the problem with that as a strategy is that it doesn't recognize the fundamental fact: campaigns cost money. So my objective is not to get money out of campaigns or get money out of politics. Procter & Gamble and Verizon spend twice as much on advertising every year as the United States spends on electing our Congress and our president. So I don't think there's any basis for thinking we're spending too much. The problem is not the spending, the problem is the fundraising. So if we change the way they raise money, then they would be dependent upon their funders, just like they are right now, but the funders would be a wide swath of us, as opposed to the tiniest fraction of us. So it would not be plausible to think of it as bribery if all we're talking about is a $50 voucher that I give to a member of Congress to help that member of Congress run her campaign. It would be kind of crazy to call that bribery, in a way that it doesn't feel crazy to imagine somebody giving $5 million to a super PAC that's supporting the candidate who wants to run his or her campaign. I get the feel that this is bribery, and of course people on the inside, like Jack Abramoff, who became quite expert at this, says it's just legalized bribery. That's all the system is right now. But let's address the legalized bribery by just changing the way we do what we will have to do, which is to fund elections. Let's fund them in a way where there's no more bribery, which means make it so that the funding all comes at such denominations that nobody could plausibly think anybody was being bribed to take one position.
Yes, wait a minute.
I have an online question for Professor Lessig. It's from Erin Carroll. Her question is, there are a lot of proposals out there to amend the Constitution. For example, Bernie Sanders introduced constitutional amendment in Senate, and Representative Ted Deutsch introduced same in the House. To ensure that the right to vote and the ability to make campaign contributions and expenditures belonging only to people, not to corporations, would you advise our supporting this and asking our congressional reps to co-sponsor this?
Well, I think that the great progress in what Bernie Sanders and Representative Deutsch have done is to begin to focus the debate away from the kind of rhetoric that took over the world after Citizens United, where so many of the proposals were proposals for declaring corporations were not persons. Now, I understand the motivation behind those political proposals. It feels good, it feels weird for us to say corporations are persons. But that issue is completely unrelated to the problem that I've described. It's not that I think that what the Supreme Court has done with that doctrine makes sense. The Supreme Court has done all sorts of crazy things under the banner of corporations are persons. But if you had an amendment in the Constitution tomorrow that said corporations are not persons, you still would live in Lesterland. We still would be in Lesterland. So I think what Bernie Sanders and Deutsch have done is to push the debate so that they're not talking about corporations as persons. They're trying to focus on who the representatives should be dependent upon. And of course I agree they should be dependent upon citizens, because whether or not a corporation is a person, nobody has ever said that a corporation is a United States citizen. So if you said it can only be citizens who fund campaigns, that's a way of saying it's not going to be corporations funding campaigns, it's not Japanese funding campaigns, it's only citizens funding campaigns. But that's still one half of the way to the reform that you need. Because it's not just a question of whether citizens are funding campaigns, it's also who among the citizens are funding campaigns. Is it all of us, or half of us, or is it 0.05% of us? And so that takes legislation, which the other part of their amendment clearly gives Congress the power to enact that legislation, but it doesn't itself create that system of citizen funding.
So how about right in the middle?
I wanted to ask what problems and solutions you anticipate there's a corruption problem, but how will corruption affect the implementation of the solutions? Meaning, when you implement a tax, you get people going to the next state to avoid the tax, or sex offender registration. I'll just go to the next town and not have to register.
Yeah, so one of the hardest things about campaign finance reform is that every single reform proposal in the history of campaign finance reform has produced these unintended consequences which subvert the objective of the reform. So let's embrace humility and acknowledge that the proposals I'm talking about also will create unintended consequences. But we actually have some experience with small dollar funded elections in states like Connecticut, Maine, and Arizona. So we have some basis for understanding which of the regimes, which kind of system will actually achieve the objective which we have. And so I'm less worried about the way in which there's a desire, for example, when you try to get rid of soft money for the money to appear someplace else. Because I think that if you have a large enough system of citizen funding, that's going to be all the incentive you need to get people to focus in the right way. Now, the biggest thing that's blocking the ability to address this corruption, though, is the bear who will at some point be awoken